Hello, I'm Joshua of Milestone Play, and I am a professional game master. Today we're going to talk about story. More specifically, telling a bigger story when we're writing our own homebrew one-shots and arcs for our campaigns and things like that. Something that I see happen when newer game masters are developing the storylines that they're going to have their players run through is they don't have enough pieces and they're not building big enough things for the players to do. Now, I'm not saying that there's not enough content. New game masters are wonderful at producing lots of details, lots of content, lots of things to do, but there's not enough steps involved in what they're generating. I'll explain. You may have a fantastic antagonist for your story. The big bad evil guy that might be a warlord, might be a wizard, a demon, a fae, a celestial, an angel. So many different things. You have a perfect bad guy that you're just waiting to show off to your players. However, chances are the players are going to want to fight that bad guy. And either this big bad evil guy might be too powerful for your players and he may kill the characters immediately, or you'll have to come up with reasons why he doesn't want to kill them. He wants to just move on, leave them groveling in the dirt, things like that. Well, that's fine, that's fantastic, but there's less for your characters to interact with. Or maybe you go by this very honestly and you have it as someone that the player characters can't fight. And then they do. And then they win. And all of a sudden, your big story doesn't have that antagonist and you're trying to come up with someone that's deeper behind in the shadows. Well, instead of having to solve one of those problems, you need someone else. You need another significant non-player character that the characters are going to interact with. It might be a known lieutenant or captain of the big bad evil guy that the player characters will interact with a bit more. It might be a sibling, a cousin. It might be a child, a significant other, a father, a mother, someone that your main antagonist cares about or has high value in keeping around. Having this secondary non-player character that is imperative to the story, but someone that isn't supposed to be the end boss, can help flesh out your narrative and give one more aspect for your characters to interact with that acts as a chess piece on the board. This secondary antagonist, this lieutenant we can call for ease, may stay around to the very end, may die early on, may be around a couple times throughout the story, but by having a secondary antagonist that the player characters will know well, will allow greater depth to the story without putting you in the position of having to use the big bad evil guy for everything. In addition to that one additional antagonist for the player characters to interact with, you're going to want one more barrier in your adventure. Now, you might be starting off in a village, going through a dark forest and finding a dungeon, and then going through the dungeon and the big bad evil guys at the end. Or you might have a swamp, you might have a mountain range, you might have an enemy faction. We'll get more on enemy factions later. But having one more barrier that isn't directly related to what the big bad evil guy is doing. If you have a warlord that is going through the countryside, raiding villages that needs to be stopped, this might be part of the geography that the party has to deal with, forests, mountains, things like that. As opposed to geography, it could be an isolated village. It could be a keep that doesn't want to get involved. It could be a wizard's tower where the wizard has better things to do. If you have another barrier between where your players start the adventure and what the end of the adventure is supposed to be, that is one more opportunity for your player characters to get to do fantastic things. Let's take that village forest dungeon example from earlier. Your player characters start off in the village, might be able to shop a little. They find out from the mayor of the town that something has happened, that the villagers have been captured by the big bad evil guy in the dungeon. They have to get through the forest to get to the dungeon, and then they have the dungeon adventure. Well, going through the forest, you probably have maybe, some goblins in the forest that the players will have to deal with, maybe a fairy ring. The forest is not about challenging the player characters. That's what the dungeon is for. The forest is about letting the player characters do something and use their abilities to get ahead. Now, if you have a bard or a druid in the party, whether it's their social skills or their nature skills, having a fairy ring in the forest can allow the player characters to gain a couple rewards, a blessing from the fairies or something like that, as they make their way to the dungeon. This is about giving the player characters something that is going to help them along the way. In addition, along the way in the forest, there might be the bog, the swamp, there might be something to hold them back. Now, this is to hold the characters back, not the players. This is an opportunity for the heroes to be able to do things successfully during the adventure. If the ranger has expertise in survival, if they're really good at doing that thing, you don't have to make the bog something difficult to get through. A couple die rolls, a couple descriptions, and some narrative along the way can be what this bog is about. If there's a levitation spell that the wizard or sorcerer has, a floating disc, something like that, to help get the party across the bog, this by no means takes more than 5 or 10 minutes out of the game. You can let the characters do the thing, get past this barrier, and be successful without holding them back. If anything, build up the danger just a little bit. That way, when they succeed and come up with a clever plan, you can give them the win. They don't have to fight for every inch of the adventure. They can do the thing. At which point, you then move on to the dungeon where there might be more trials for them that might have a few more setbacks. The idea of adding the additional barrier for the characters is to allow them to overcome the barrier with their abilities, especially as you get to higher levels of D&D, where you can easily get a bunch of player characters flying around, you can get teleportations, you can get these wonderful abilities, you can get the ability to shape rock, to move plants. These abilities are meant to be used, and by providing 1 or 2 additional barriers to the player characters, those are opportunities for those heroes to be able to deal with the problem and move on quickly. So we have one more antagonist for your player characters to get to deal with besides the big bad evil guy at the end. We have another barrier for them to successfully overcome. The final thing to make your story just a little bit bigger is going to be a faction. This could be an ally faction or an enemy faction. It could be a guild of adventurers or even labor folk to help get your party to the adventure location. It could be the Hammertoe clan of hobgoblins that are in the area. It could be a court of fairy. It could be so many different things. The idea of including this bigger faction is to almost have it be a stereotype. Now, it doesn't have to be a cliche, but by having a very distinct identity to this faction is to give your players the ability to comfortably interact with this faction. If it is an ally faction, they know what this faction is good for and the type of individuals that they can get to help them. If it's an enemy faction, it's knowing how the enemies interact. If the enemies are wild and chaotic and run in, they know that they can deal with the enemy faction that way. If the faction is very organized and they group up and they have formations, well, you know that the wizard and the sorcerer are going to be able to throw fireballs at them and deal with them. Having the faction is about giving your players something that is familiar and something that they can easily deal with as a bottom layer to whatever the specific challenges that they're dealing with in the dungeon, in the adventure is going to be. While they're trying to deal with that NPC that we talked about earlier, that lieutenant that has all their specificity, you can have an entire faction underneath that allows for more things going on at any given moment, but is easily managed by the players. By having that secondary antagonist, we have another playing piece for the game master to have on the field. Whether they're beaten or not, doesn't matter. You still have the end goal at the end. We have the barriers that the player characters are meant to overcome and gives them a chance to highlight their characters without having to severely challenge them and make them feel like they're always fighting an uphill battle. And finally, that faction allows for a background that, while it might be helpful, it might be harmful, it allows for the player characters to have something familiar that they know how it operates. All of these different layers build out a bigger story that it doesn't have to be all that more complicated. All of these things can be included in a one-shot. It doesn't have to take more time. It is simply giving the players a bigger story to play through, and by having more pieces, you can tell the player characters yes more often. You don't have to tell them no, you can't kill the big bad right now, they have to stay around to the end. The antagonist can be that victory at the beginning. The barriers allow for the characters to do more along the way, as opposed to having to grind through a slog. They are succeeding to the end. And then having that faction is just ground support all around. So tell a bigger story, let your characters do more in less time. Thanks for watching the video. It was made with the support of our patrons over on Patreon, where you can see behind-the-scenes content and the development of our own TTRPG systems. If you're looking to join a game, head on down to the description where we have a link to our Discord. You can join long-form campaigns, short mini-series for bite-sized narratives, or quick dips into systems you don't want a long-term commitment to, or you can join our Tower of Taziok. Tower of Taziok is a 5th edition infinite dungeon with roguelite elements, legacy play, and downtime synchronous with the real world. After you form a house of patronage, every week that passes in your life, your character gets a week of downtime. Everything else you can check out milestoneplay.com, and yeah, thanks for watching. Let's get going.